This is section 15 of Happy Homes and the Hearts That Make Them by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Money, Its Use and Abuse. Read by John Greenman. Not for to hide it in a hedge, nor for a train attendant, but for the glorious privilege of being independent. Burns. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. Shakespeare. Whoever has a sixpence is sovereign over all men to the extent of that sixpence, commands cooks to feed him, philosophers to teach him, kings to guard over him, to the extent of that sixpence. Carlyle. How a man uses money, makes it, saves it, and spends it, is perhaps one of the best tests of practical wisdom. Although money ought by no means to be regarded as the chief end of man's life, neither is it a trifling matter to be held in philosophic contempt, representing as it does to so large an extent the means of physical comfort and social well-being. Indeed, some of the finest qualities of human nature are intimately related to the right use of money, such as generosity, honesty, justice, and self-sacrifice, as well as the practical virtues of economy and providence. On the other hand, there are their counterparts of avarice, fraud, injustice, and selfishness, as displayed by the inordinate lovers of gain, and the vices of thriftlessness, extravagance, and improvidence on the part of those who misuse and abuse the means entrusted to them. So that, as is wisely observed by Henry Taylor in his thoughtful Notes from Life, a right measure and manner in getting, saving, spending, giving, taking, lending, borrowing, and bequeathing would almost argue a perfect man. Comfort in worldly circumstances is a condition which every man is justified in striving to attain by all worthy means. It secures that physical satisfaction which is necessary for the culture of the better part of his nature, and enables him to provide for those of his own household, without which, says the Apostle, a man is worse than an infidel. Nor ought the duty to be any the less pleasing to us that the respect which our fellow men entertain for us in no slight degree depends upon the manner in which we exercise the opportunities which present themselves for our honorable advancement in life. The very effort required to be made to succeed in life with this object is of itself an education, stimulating a man's sense of self-respect, bringing out his practical qualities, and disciplining him in the exercise of patience, perseverance, and such like virtues. The provident and careful man must necessarily be a thoughtful man, for he lives not merely for the present, but with provident forecast makes arrangements for the future. He must also be a temperate man, and exercise the virtue of self-denial, than which nothing is so much calculated to give strength to the character. John Sterling says truly that the worst education which teaches self-denial is better than the best, which teaches everything else and not that. Hence the lesson of self-denial, the sacrificing of a present gratification for a future good, is one of the last that is learned. Those classes which work the hardest might naturally be expected to value the most the money which they earn, yet the readiness with which so many are accustomed to eat up and drink up their earnings as they go, renders them to a great extent helpless and dependent upon the frugal. There are large numbers of persons among us who, though enjoying sufficient means of comfort and independence, are often found to be barely a day's march ahead of actual want when a time of pressure occurs, and hence a great cause of social helplessness and suffering. On one occasion a deputation waited on Lord John Russell, respecting the taxation levied on the working classes of the country, when the noble lord took the opportunity of remarking, "You may rely upon it that the government of this country does not tax the working classes to anything like the extent to which they tax themselves in their expenditure upon intoxicating drinks alone. Providence, frugality, and good management," said Samuel Drew, the philosophical shoemaker, "are excellent artists for mending bad times. They occupy but little room in any dwelling, but would furnish a more effectual remedy for the evils of life than any reform bill that ever passed the Houses of Parliament." Socrates said, "Let him that would move the world move first himself." Any class of men that lives from hand to mouth will ever be an inferior class. They will necessarily remain impotent and helpless, hanging on to the skirts of society, the sport of times and seasons. Having no respect for themselves, they will fail in securing the respect of others. In commercial crisis, such men must inevitably go to the wall. Wanting that husbanded power, with a store of savings no matter how small, invariably gives them, they will be at every man's mercy, and if possessed of right feelings, they cannot but regard with fear and trembling the future possible fate of their wives and children. "The world," said Mr. Cobden, "has always been divided into two classes, those who have saved and those who have spent, the thrifty and the extravagant. The building of all the houses, the mills, the bridges, and the ships, and the accomplishment of all other great works which have rendered man civilized and happy, has been done by the savers, the thrifty, and those who have wasted their resources have always been their slaves. It has been the law of nature and of Providence that this should be so, and I were an impostor if I promised any class that they would advance themselves if they were improvident, thoughtless, and idle." Equally sound was the advice given by Mr. Bright to an assembly of working men, when, after expressing his belief that, so far as honesty was concerned, it was to be found in pretty equal amount among all classes, he used the following words: "There is only one way that is safe for any man, or any number of men, by which they can maintain their present position, if it be a good one, or raise themselves above it, if it be a bad one. That is, by the practice of the virtues of industry, frugality, temperance, and honesty. There is no royal road by which men can raise themselves from a position which they feel to be uncomfortable and unsatisfactory as regards their mental or physical condition, except by the practice of those virtues by which they find numbers amongst them are continually advancing and bettering themselves. There is no reason why the condition of the average workman should not be a useful, honorable, respectable, and happy one. The whole body of the working classes might be as frugal, virtuous, well-informed, and well-conditioned as many individuals of the same class have already made themselves. What some men are, all without difficulty might be. Employ the same means, and the same results will follow. The healthy spirit of self-help created amongst working people would more than any other measure serve to raise them as a class, and this, not by pulling down others, but by leveling them up to a higher and still advancing standard of religion, intelligence, and virtue. "All moral philosophy," says Montaigne, "is as applicable to a common and private life as to the most splendid. Every man carries the entire form of the human condition with him." When a man casts his glance forward, he will find that the three chief temporal contingencies for which he has to provide are want of employment, sickness, and death. The two first he may escape, but the last is inevitable. It is, however, the duty of the prudent man so to live and so to arrange that the pressure of suffering, in the event of either contingencies occurring, shall be mitigated to as great an extent as possible, not only to himself, but also to those who are dependent upon him for their comfort and subsistence. Viewed in this light, the honest earning and the frugal use of money are of the greatest importance. Rightly earned, it is the representative of patient industry and untiring effort, of temptation resisted and hope rewarded; and rightly used, it affords indications of prudence, forethought, and self-denial, the true basis of manly character. Though money represents a crowd of objects without any real worth or utility, it also represents many things of great value, not only food, clothing, and household satisfaction, but personal self-respect and independence. Thus a store of savings is to the working man as a barricade against want. It secures him a footing, and enables him to wait, it may be in cheerfulness and hope, until better days come round. The very endeavor to gain a firmer position in the world has certain dignity in it, and tends to make a man stronger and better. At all events, it gives him greater freedom of action, and enables him to husband his strength for future effort. But the man who is always hovering on the verge of want is in a state not far removed from that of slavery. He is in no sense his own master, but is in constant peril of falling under the bondage of others, and accepting the terms which they dictate to him. He can not help being in a measure servile, for he dares not look the world boldly in the face, and in adverse times he must look either to alms or the poor's rates. If work fails him altogether, he has not the means of moving to another field of employment. To secure independence, the practice of simple economy is all that is necessary. Economy requires neither superior courage nor eminent virtue. It is satisfied with ordinary energy and the capacity of average minds. Economy, at bottom, is but the spirit of order applied in the administration of domestic affairs. It means management, regularity, prudence, and the avoidance of waste. Francis Horner's father gave him this advice on entering life: "Whilst I wish you to be comfortable in every respect, I cannot too strongly inculcate economy. It is a necessary virtue to all, and however the shallow part of mankind may despise it, it certainly leads to independence, which is a grand object to every man of a high spirit." It was a maxim of Lord Bacon that when it was necessary to economize, it was better to look after petty savings than to descend to petty gettings. The loose cash which many persons throw away uselessly, and worse, would often form a basis of fortune and independence for life. These wasters are their own worst enemies, though generally found amongst the ranks of those who rail at the injustice of the world. But if a man will not be his own friend, how can he expect that others will? Orderly men of the moderate means have always something left in their pockets to help others, whereas your prodigal and careless fellows who spend all never find an opportunity for helping anybody. It is poor economy, however, to be a scrub. Narrow-mindedness in living and in dealing is generally short-sighted, and leads to failure. The penny soul, it is said, never came to twopence. Generosity and liberality, like honesty, prove the best policy after all. The proverb says that an empty bag cannot stand upright. Neither can a man who is in debt. It is also difficult for a man who is in debt to be truthful. Hence it is said that lying rides on debt's back. The debtor has to frame excuses to his creditor for postponing payment of the money he owes him, and probably also to contrive falsehoods. It is easy enough for a man who will exercise a healthy resolution to avoid incurring the first obligation, but the facility with which that has been incurred often becomes a temptation to a second, and very soon the unfortunate borrower becomes so entangled that no late exertion of industry can set him free. The first step in debt is like the first step in falsehoods. almost involving the necessity of proceeding in the same course, debt following debt, as lie follows lie. Haydn, the painter, dated his decline from the day on which he first borrowed money. He realized the truth of the proverb, "Who goes a-borrowing, goes a-sorrowing." The significant entry in his diary is, "Here began debt and obligation, out of which I have never been and never shall be extricated as long as I live." His autobiography shows but too painfully how embarrassment in money matters produces poignant distress of mind, utter incapacity for work, and constantly recurring humiliations. The written advice which he gave to a youth when entering the Navy was as follows: "Never purchase any enjoyment if it can not be procured without borrowing of others. Never borrow money; it is degrading. I do not say never lend, but never lend if by lending you render yourself unable to pay what you owe. But under any circumstances never borrow." Fichte, the poor student, refused to accept even presents from his still poorer parents. Dr. Johnson held that early debt is ruin. His words on the subject are weighty, and worthy of being held in remembrance. "Do not," said he, "accustom yourself to consider debt only as an inconvenience. You will find it a calamity. Poverty takes away so many means of doing good, and produces so much inability to resist evil, both natural and moral, that it is by all virtuous means to be avoided. Let it be your first care, then, not to be in any man's debt. Resolve not to be poor. Whatever you have, spend less. Poverty is a great enemy to human happiness. It certainly destroys liberty, and it makes some virtues impracticable and others extremely difficult. Frugality is not only the basis of quiet, but of beneficence. No man can help others that wants help himself. We must have enough before we have to spare. It is the bounden duty of every man to look his affairs in the face, and to keep an account of his incomings and outgoings in money matters. The exercise of a little simple arithmetic in this way will be found of great value. Prudence requires that we shall pitch our scale of living a degree below our means. But this can only be done by carrying out faithfully a plan of living by which both ends may be made to meet. John Locke strongly advised this course. "Nothing," said he, "is likelier to keep a man within compass than having constantly before his eyes the state of his affairs in a regular course of account." The Duke of Wellington kept an accurate detailed account of all the money received and expended by him. Washington was very particular in matters of business detail, and it is a remarkable fact that he did not disdain to scrutinize the smallest outgoings of his household, determined as he was to live honestly within his means, even when holding the high office of President of the American Union. Admiral Jervis has told the story of his early struggles, and amongst other things of his determination to keep out of debt. "My father had a very large family," said he, "with limited means. He gave me £20 at starting, and that was all he ever gave me. After I had been a considerable time at the station I drew for 20 more, but the bill came back protested. I was mortified at this rebuke, and made a promise, which I have ever kept, that I would never draw another bill without a certainty of it being paid. I immediately changed my mode of living, quitted my mess, lived alone, and took up the ship's allowance, which I found quite sufficient, washed and mended my own clothes, made a pair of trousers out of the ticking of my bed, and having by these means saved as much money as would redeem my honor, I took up my bill, and from that time to this I have taken care to keep within my means." Jervis for 6 years endured pinching privation, but preserved his integrity, studied his profession with success, and gradually and steadily rose by merit and bravery to the highest rank. Middle-class people are too apt to live up to their incomes, if not beyond them, affecting a degree of style which is most unhealthy in its effects upon society at large. There is an ambition to bring up boys as gentlemen, or rather genteel men, though the result frequently is only to make them gents. They acquire a taste for dress, style, luxuries, and amusements, which can never form any solid foundation for manly or gentlemanly character, and the result is that we have a vast number of gingerbread young gentry thrown upon the world, who remind one of the abandoned hulls sometimes picked up at sea, with only a monkey on board. There is a dreadful ambition abroad for being genteel. We keep up appearances, too often at the expense of honesty, and, though we may not be rich, yet we must seem to be so. We must be respectable, though only in the meanest sense, in mere vulgar outward show. We have not the courage to go patiently onward in the condition in life in which it has pleased God to call us, but must needs live in some fashionable state to which we ridiculously please to call ourselves, and to gratify the vanity of that unsubstantial genteel world of which we form a part. There is a constant struggle and pressure for front seats in the social amphitheatre, in the midst of which all noble self-denying resolve is trodden down, and many fine natures are inevitably crushed to death. What waste, what misery, what bankruptcy come from all this ambition to dazzle others with the glare of apparent worldly success, we need not describe. The mischievous results show themselves in 1,000 ways, in the rank frauds committed by men who dare to be dishonest, but do not dare to seem poor. There are rogues innumerable who are ready to sell their bodies and souls for money and for drink. Who has not heard of the elections which have been made void through bribery and corruption? This is not the way to enjoy liberty, or to keep it. The men who sell themselves are slaves. Their buyers are dishonest and unprincipled. Freedom has its humbugs. "I'm standing on the soil of liberty," said an orator. "You ain't," replied a bootmaker in the audience. "You are standing on a pair of boots you never paid me for." The ignorant and careless are at the mercy of the unprincipled, and the ignorant are as yet greatly in the majority. When a French quack was taken before the correctional tribunal at Paris for obstructing the Pont Neuf, the magistrate said to him, "Sirrah, how is it you draw such crowds about you, and extract so much money from them in selling your infallible rubbish?" "My lord," replied the quack, "how many people do you think cross the Pont Neuf in the hour?" "I don't know," said the judge. "Then I can tell you, about 10,000. And how many of these do you think are wise?" "Oh, perhaps 100. "It is too many," said the quack. "But I leave the 100 persons to you, and take the 9,900 for my customers." Aristides was called the Just from his unbending integrity. His sense of justice was spotless, and his self-denial unimpeachable. He fought at Marathon, at Salamis, and commanded at the battle of Plataea. Though he had borne the highest offices in the state, he died poor. Nothing could buy him, nothing could induce him to swerve from his duty. It is said that the Athenians became more virtuous from contemplating his bright example. In the representation of one of the tragedies of Aeschylus, a sentence was uttered in favor of moral goodness, on which the eyes of the audience turned involuntarily from the actor to Aristides. Phocion, the Athenian general, a man of great bravery and foresight, was surnamed the Good. Alexander the Great, when overrunning Greece, endeavored to win him from his loyalty. He offered him riches, and the choice of 4 cities in Asia. The answer of Phocion bespoke the spotless character of the man. "If Alexander really esteems me," he said, "let him leave me my honesty." Yet Demosthenes, the eloquent, could be bought. When Harpalus, one of Alexander's chiefs, came to Athens, the orators had an eye upon his gold. Demosthenes was one of them. What is eloquence without honesty? On his visit to Harpalus, the chief perceived that Demosthenes was much pleased with one of the king's beautiful engraved cups. He desired him to take it in his hand, that he might feel its weight. "How much might it bring?" asked Demosthenes. "It will bring you 20 talents," replied Harpalus. That night the cup was sent to Demosthenes, with 20 talents in it. The present was not refused. The circumstance led to the disgrace of the orator, and he soon after poisoned himself. Cicero, on the other hand, refused all presents from friends as well as from the enemies of his country. Some time after his assassination, Caesar found one of his grandsons with a book of Cicero's in his hands. The boy endeavored to hide it, but Caesar took it from him. After having run over it, he returned it to the boy, saying, "My dear child, this was an eloquent man, and a lover of his country." Goldsmith also was a man who would not be bought. He had known the depths of poverty. He had wandered over Europe paying his way with his flute. He had slept in barns and under the open sky. He tried acting, ushering, doctoring. He starved amid them all. Then he tried authorship, and became a gentleman. But he never quite escaped from the clutches of poverty. He described himself as "in a garret writing for bread, and expecting to be dunned for a milk score." One day Johnson received a message from Goldsmith, stating that he was in great distress. The doctor went to see him, and found that his landlady had arrested him for his rent. The only thing he had to dispose of was a packet of manuscript. Johnson took it up, and found it to be the Vicar of Wakefield. Having ascertained its merit, Johnson took it to a bookseller and sold it for £60. Poor though he was then, and poor though he was at the end of his life, for he died in debt, Goldsmith could not be bought. He refused to do dirty political work. About $250,000 annually was then expended by Sir Robert Walpole in Secret Service money. Daily scribblers were suborned to write up the acts of the administration, and to write down those of their opponents. In the time of Lord North, Junius was in opposition. It was resolved to hire Goldsmith to baffle his terrible sarcasm. Dr. Scott, chaplain to Lord Sandwich, was deputed to negotiate with him. "I found him," says Dr. Scott, "in a terrible suite of chambers in the Temple. I told him my authority. I told him how I was empowered to pay for his exertions, and, would you believe it, he was so absurd as to say, 'I can earn as much as will supply my wants without writing for any party. The assistance you offer is therefore unnecessary to me,' and so I left him in his garret." Nothing is more creditable to American statesmanship than the fact that most of our presidents at death have left their families in very moderate circumstances. Garfield and Lincoln, whose positions would have enabled them, by accepting gifts and bribes, to have accumulated immense wealth, died poor and in debt, although they were rich in the affection of a grateful people. The same is true of our most honored statesmen. That bribery and corruption exists in our politics, and often controls legislation, cannot be denied. But it should also be said, to the great credit of a vigilant popular censorship, that corrupt and venal statesmen, when they become known as such, are promptly relegated to private life. The young man, as he passes through life, advances through a long line of tempters ranged on either side of him, and the inevitable effect of yielding is degradation in a greater or less degree. Contact with them tends insensibly to draw away from him some portion of the divine electric element with which his nature is charged, and his only mode of resisting them is to utter and act out his "no" manfully and resolutely. He must decide at once, not waiting to deliberate and balance reasons; for the youth, like the woman who deliberates, is lost. Temptation will come to try the young man's strength, and Once yielded to, the power to resist grows weaker and weaker. Yield once, and a portion of virtue is gone. Resist manfully, and the first decision will give strength for life. Repeated, it will become a habit. It is in the outworks of the habits formed in early life that the real strength of the defense must lie, for it has been wisely ordained that the machinery of moral existence should be carried on principally through the medium of the habits, so as to save the wear and tear of the great principles within. It is good habits, which insinuate themselves into the thousand inconsiderable acts of life, that really constitute by far the greater part of man's moral conduct. Hugh Miller has told how, by an act of youthful decision, he saved himself from one of the strong temptations so peculiar to a life of toil. When employed as a mason, it was usual for his fellow workmen to have an occasional treat of drink, and one day 2 glasses of whisky fell to his share, which he swallowed. When he reached home he found, on opening his favorite book, Bacon's Essays, that the letters danced before his eyes, and that he could no longer master the sense. The condition, he says, into which I had brought myself was, I felt, one of degradation. I had sunk, by my own act, for the time, to a lower level of intelligence than that on which it was my privilege to be placed. And, though the state could have been no very favorable one for forming a resolution, I in that hour determined that I should never again sacrifice my capacity of intellectual enjoyment to a drinking usage, and, with God's help, I was enabled to hold by the determination. It is such decisions as this that often form the turning points in a man's life, and furnish the foundation of his future character. And this rock, on which Hugh Miller might have been wrecked, if he had not at the right moment put forth his moral strength to strike away from it, is one that youth and manhood alike need to be constantly on their guard against. It is about one of the worst and most deadly, as well as extravagant, temptations which lie in the way of youth. Sir Walter Scott used to say that, "Of all vices, drinking is the most incompatible with greatness." Not only so, but it is incompatible with economy, decency, health, and honest living. Dr. Johnson said, referring to his own habits, "Sir, I can abstain, but I can't be moderate." Many popular books have been written for the purpose of communicating to the public the grand secret of making money, but there is no secret whatever about it, as the proverbs of every nation abundantly testify. "Take care of the pennies, and the pounds will take care of themselves." "Diligence is the mother of good luck." "No pains, no gains." "No sweat, no sweet." "Work, and thou shalt have." "The world is his who has patience and industry." "Better go to bed supperless than rise in debt." Such are specimens of the proverbial philosophy, embodying the hoarded experience of many generations, as to the best means of thriving in the world. They were current in people's mouths long before books were invented, and, like other popular proverbs, they were the first popular morals. Moreover, they have stood the test of time, and the experience of every day still bears witness to their accuracy, force, and soundness. The Proverbs of Solomon are full of wisdom as to the force of industry, and the use and abuse of money. "He that is slothful in work is brother to him that is a great waster." "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise." "Poverty," says the preacher, "shall come upon the idler as one that traveleth, and want as an armed man. But of the industrious and upright, the hand of the diligent maketh rich." "The drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags." "Seest thou a man diligent in his business, he shall stand before kings." But above all, "It is better to get wisdom than gold, for wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things that may be desired are not to be compared to it. Simple industry and thrift will go far towards making any person of ordinary working faculty comparatively independent in his means. Even a working man may be so, provided he will carefully husband his resources, and watch the little outlets of useless expenditure. A penny is a very small matter, yet the comfort of thousands of families depends upon the proper spending and saving of pennies. If a man allows the little pennies, the results of his hard work, to slip out of his fingers, some to the beer shop, some this way and some that, he will find that his life is little raised above one of mere animal drudgery. On the other hand, if he takes care of the pennies, putting some weekly into a savings bank, and confiding the rest to his wife to be carefully laid out, with a view to the comfortable maintenance and education of his family, he will soon find that this attention to small matters will abundantly repay him in increasing means, growing comfort at home, and a mind comparatively free from fears as to the future. And if a working man have high ambition and possess richness in spirit, a kind of wealth which far transcends all mere worldly possessions, he may not only help himself, but be a profitable helper of others in his path through life. That this is no impossible thing even for a common laborer in a workshop may be illustrated by the remarkable career of Thomas Wright of Manchester, who not only attempted but succeeded in the reclamation of many criminals while working for weekly wages in a foundry. Accident first directed Thomas Wright's attention to the difficulty encountered by liberated convicts in returning to habits of honest industry. His mind was shortly possessed by the subject, and to remedy the evil became the purpose of his life. Though he worked from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, still there were leisure minutes that he could call his own, more especially his Sundays, and these he employed in the service of convicted criminals, a class then far more neglected than they are now. But a few minutes a day, well employed, can effect a great deal, and it will scarcely be credited that in 10 years this working man, by steadfastly holding to his purpose, succeeded in rescuing not fewer than 300 felons from continuance in a life of villainy. He came to be regarded as the moral physician of the Manchester Old Bailey, and where the chaplain and all others failed, Thomas Wright often succeeded. Children he thus restored, reformed, to their parents; sons and daughters, otherwise lost, to their homes; and many a returned convict did he contrive to settle down to honest and industrious pursuits. The task was by no means easy. It required money, time, energy, prudence, and, above all, character, and the confidence which character invariably inspires. The most remarkable circumstance was that Wright relieved many of these poor outcasts out of the comparatively small wages earned by him at foundry work. He did all this on an income which did not average, during his working career, $500 per annum; and yet, while he was able to bestow substantial aid on criminals, to whom he owed no more than the service of kindness which every human being owes to another, he also maintained his family in comfort, and was, by frugality and carefulness, enabled to lay by a store of savings against his approaching old age. Every week he apportioned his income with deliberate care; so much for the indispensable necessaries of food and clothing, so much for the landlord, so much for the schoolmaster, so much for the poor and needy, and the lines of distribution were resolutely observed. By such means did this humble workman pursue his great work, with the results we have so briefly described. Indeed, his career affords one of the most remarkable and striking illustrations of the force of purpose in a man, of the might of small means carefully and sedulously applied, and, above all, of the power which an energetic and upright character invariably exercises upon the lives and conduct of others. There is no discredit, but honor, in every right walk of industry, whether it be in tilling the ground, making tools, weaving fabrics, or selling the products behind a counter. A youth may handle a yardstick or measure a piece of ribbon, and there will be no discredit in doing so, unless he allows his mind to have no higher range than the stick and ribbon, to be as short as the one and as narrow as the other. "Let not those blush who have," said Fuller, "but those who have not a lawful calling." And Bishop Hall said, "Sweet is the destiny of all trades, whether of the brow or of the mind." One of our Presidents, when asked what was his coat of arms, remembering that he had been a hewer of wood in his youth, replied, "A pair of shirt sleeves." Nothing is more common than energy in money making, quite independent of any higher object than its accumulation. A man who devotes himself to this pursuit, body and soul, can scarcely fail to become rich. Very little brains will do. Spend less than you earn, add guinea to guinea, scrape and save, and the pile of gold will gradually rise. John Foster has cited a striking illustration of what determination will do in money making. A young man who ran through his patrimony, spending it in profligacy, was at length reduced to utter want and despair. He rushed out of his house intending to put an end to his life, and stopped on arriving at an eminence overlooking what were once his estates. He sat down, ruminated for a time, and rose with the determination that he would recover them. He returned to the streets, saw a load of coal which had been shot out of a cart onto the pavement before a house, offered to carry it in, and was employed. He thus earned a few pence, requested some meat and drink as a gratuity, which was given him, and the pennies were laid by. Pursuing this menial labor, he earned and saved more pennies, accumulated sufficient to enable him to purchase some cattle, the value of which he understood, and these he sold to advantage. He proceeded by degrees to undertake larger transactions, until at length he became rich. The result was that he more than recovered his possessions, and died an inveterate miser. When he was buried, mere earth went to earth. With a nobler spirit, the same determination might have enabled such a man to be a benefactor to others as well as to himself. But the life and its end in this case were alike sordid. To provide for others and for our own comfort and independence in old age is honorable and greatly to be commended, but to hoard for mere wealth's sake is the characteristic of the narrow-souled and the miserly. It is against the growth of this habit of inordinate saving that the wise man needs most carefully to guard himself, else what in youth was simple economy may in old age grow into avarice, and what was a duty in the one case may become a vice in the other. It is one of the defects of business, too exclusively followed, that it insensibly tends to a mechanism of character. The business man gets into a rut, and often does not look beyond it. If he lives for himself only, he becomes apt to regard other human beings only in so far as they minister to his ends. Take a leaf from such a man's ledger, and you have his life. Respectability, in its best sense, is good. The respectable man is one worthy of regard, literally worth turning to look at. But the respectability that consists in merely keeping up appearances is not worth looking at in any sense. Far better and more respectable is the good poor man than the bad rich one, better the humble silent man than the agreeable, well-appointed rogue who keeps his gig. A well-balanced and well-stored mind, a life full of useful purpose, whatever the position occupied in it may be, is of far greater importance than average worldly respectability. The highest object of life we take to be to form a manly character, and to work out the best development possible of body and spirit, of mind, conscience, heart and soul. This is the end. All else ought to be regarded but as the means. Accordingly, that is not the most successful life in which a man gets the most pleasure, the most money, the most power or place, honor or fame. but that in which a man gets the most manhood, and performs the greatest amount of useful work and of human duty. Money is power after its sort, it is true; but intelligence, public spirit, and moral virtue are powers too, and far nobler ones. When Sir Humphrey Davy, after great labor, invented his safety lamp, for the purpose of mitigating the dangers to colliers working in inflammable gas, he would not take out a patent for it, but made it over to the public. A friend said to him, "You might as well have secured this invention by a patent, and received your 5,000 or 10,000 a year for it." "No, my good friend," said Davy, "I never thought of such a thing. My sole object was to serve the cause of humanity. I have enough for all my views and purposes. More wealth might distract my attention from my favorite pursuits. More wealth could not increase either my fame or my happiness. It might undoubtedly enable me to put 4 horses to my carriage, but what would it avail me to have it said that Sir Humphrey drives his carriage and 4? The making of a fortune may no doubt enable some people to enter society, as it is called; but to be esteemed there they must possess qualities of mind, manners, or heart, else they are merely rich people, nothing more. There are men in society now as rich as Croesus, who have no consideration extended towards them, and elicit no respect. For why? They are but as money bags. Their only power is in their till. The men of mark in society, the guides and rulers of opinion, the really successful and useful men, are not necessarily rich men, but men of sterling character, of disciplined experience, and of moral excellence. Even the poor man, like Thomas Wright, though he possess but little of this world's goods, may, in the enjoyment of a cultivated nature, of opportunities used and not abused, of a life spent to the best of his means and ability, look down, without the slightest feeling of envy, upon the person of mere worldly success, the man of money bags and acres. Chapter 15. Money, its Use and Abuse. Read by John Greenman.